The man at the back of the ferry didn't look like trouble. That was the point. Callum Reeves sat with his back against the hull wall, one arm resting across his knee, the other loose at his side. His jacket was olive green, worn at the elbows. His boots were scuffed but clean. He had the kind of face that didn't invite conversation, not unfriendly, just settled, like a man who'd long since made peace with silence. Beside him, Kodiak lay stretched across the floor, his big head resting on his front paws, amber eyes half closed. A German shepherd, 94 pounds, with a black saddle marking that ran from his shoulders to the base of his tail. To anyone watching, he looked like any man's dog on a long trip. He was not. The BC Ferry's vessel Queen of Alberni cut through the gray waters of the Strait of Georgia, bound from Horseshoe Bay to Langdale. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and the passenger deck was thinly populated. A few families, a pair of hikers with muddy gaiters, an older woman reading a paperback with a lighthouse on the cover. The kind of crossing that usually meant 40 minutes of watching the mountains and drinking bad coffee. Callum wasn't watching the mountains. He was on leave. 14 days. His first in almost 2 years. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, which was exactly how he wanted it. A cabin outside of Saint-Chult, borrowed from a retired chief petty officer who owed him a favor he'd never asked to be repaid. Just the two of them, him and Kodiak, and 2 weeks of nothing that needed doing. He closed his eyes. He didn't hear them come in so much as feel the shift in the air. 3 of them through the forward door, 1 more trailing. They weren't loud at first. That came later. They spread out along the row of plastic chairs on the port side, taking up space the way certain men do. Not because they need it, but because taking it is the point. Young, mid-20s, wearing the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been checked. Callum didn't open his eyes. Kodiak's ears moved. The one who would cause the most trouble was named Darcy. He had a shaved head and a tattoo curling up from his collar that Callum couldn't make out from where he sat. He was the kind of man who scanned a room the same way a child sizes up a playground, looking not for friendship but for the weakest point of entry. His eyes found the older woman first. "Nice book," Darcy said, stopping beside her. He didn't wait for a response. He picked it up off her lap. She reached for it immediately. He held it over his head, laughing. His friends watched. One of them, shorter, with a gold chain, smirked. The other 2 said nothing, which was its own kind of permission. The woman said, "Please." That word. Callum had heard it in a lot of different places, spoken quietly without much hope attached. He opened his eyes. Darcy looked at her like she was scenery. He dropped the book on the floor, pages splaying. He didn't walk away. He stood there making sure she felt how small she was, before finally drifting toward the aft end of the cabin, toward Callum. Kodiak watched him come, not with aggression, with attention. There was a difference, and Kodiak understood it precisely. Darcy stopped about 6 feet away. He looked at the dog. He looked at Callum. "That thing's supposed to be on a leash?" Callum said. "He's fine. I don't like dogs." "That's okay." Something passed through Darcy's face. He wasn't used to short answers. He was used to people rushing to fill the silence, to apologize, to shrink. Callum offered none of that. "Move him," Darcy said. "He's not in your way." Darcy looked at his friends, the smirk again. He stepped closer and kicked at the floor near Kodiak's head, not connecting, but close. A threat. A test. Kodiak didn't flinch. His eyes tracked the foot with calm, surgical precision. Callum's expression didn't change either, but something behind his eyes went very quiet, the kind of quiet that precedes decisions. "Do that again," Callum said, "and we're going to have a conversation you won't enjoy." Darcy blinked. He hadn't expected that. Nobody speaks to you like that, Callum knew, until someone does. And the first time it happens is always the hardest thing in the world to process. "Yeah?" Darcy said. "And who the hell are you?" Callum looked at him for a moment without answering, not because he was thinking of something to say, because the answer didn't matter. Not yet. What he was actually doing was counting. 4 of them. The gold chain one was closest to the door. That mattered. The one near the window had his hands in his pockets, which could mean nothing or could mean something. The fourth, the trailing one, had drifted toward the far end of the cabin, which suggested either instinct or instruction. Darcy kicked again. This time his boot caught Kodiak's side. Not hard. Hard enough. Kodiak made no sound. He stood up slowly, calmly, and pressed himself against Callum's leg. That was when Callum stood. He was not a large man in the way people picture. Not barrel-chested, not movie poster wide. He was lean, controlled, the kind of build that doesn't announce itself until it's already in motion. He rose from his seat the way a tide rises. Quiet, and then suddenly very present. "Walk away," Callum said. Darcy laughed. He turned to the gold chain one. "You hearing this guy? Some things cannot be unstarted." What happened next took 11 seconds. Callum counted them afterward, the way he always did. Not from vanity but from habit, because in his world, knowing exactly what you did and when was how you survived doing it again. Darcy reached for him. That was his first mistake. The second was telegraphing it. Callum moved inside the reach, used the momentum, and Darcy sat down on the floor hard, his back against the seat row, eyes blinking, not entirely sure what had just happened. The gold chain one came fast. Callum stepped aside and the man's own speed did most of the work. The one by the window pulled his hands from his pockets. "Don't," Callum said. The man stopped. The fourth one, from the far end, was already backing toward the door. Kodiak stood between Callum and the two men on the floor, perfectly still, watching, waiting. He was not growling. He didn't need to. 3 passengers were staring. The older woman had picked up her book from the floor and was holding it against her chest. A crew member appeared in the doorway, young woman, maybe 25, eyes wide. What's happening?" "Call the terminal," Callum said quietly. "Have the RCMP meet the boat at Langdale." She nodded and disappeared. Darcy was starting to find his voice again. You have any idea who my uncle is?" Callum looked down at him. "No, Chief Municipal Officer of Sunshine Coast Regional District. Ray Benfield." He said it the way people say names they've used as shields their whole lives. "You just assaulted me on a public ferry. You're done." Callum said nothing. He sat back down. He put his hand on Kodiak's back. It would have been the end of a smaller story. The kind that resolves on a dock, with a slap on the wrist and a form filed in triplicate. But stories that involve the right names in small places rarely end that cleanly. Ray Benfield was a real person. Callum hadn't known that. He learned it 40 minutes later, standing on the Langdale ferry terminal dock, while 2 RCMP officers, one young, one not, listened to Darcy talk, and talked back in the tone of men who had listened to Darcy before. The younger officer took Callum's statement. He wrote things down. He was polite and professional. But when Darcy said, "My uncle's going to hear about this before you get back to the detachment," the younger officer's pen stopped moving for just a moment, just a breath. And then he kept writing. Callum noticed. He let it go. He had the cabin for 2 weeks. He had Kodiak. He had 14 days of nothing, and that was enough. Except it wasn't. On the second evening in Setchelt, he was walking Kodiak along the waterfront trail near the inlet. The air was cold and clean and smelled like salt cedar. Kodiak walked slightly ahead, unhurried, nose moving through layers of information Callum would never have access to. A woman was sitting on one of the low benches near the trailhead. Mid-50s, heavy jacket, hands wrapped around a takeaway coffee cup. She had the look of someone who'd been sitting there long enough to know whether she wanted to be. She looked up at Kodiak and smiled. "Beautiful dog, thank you," Callum said, and kept walking. "You were on the ferry," she said. He stopped. She wasn't looking at him like a threat. She was looking at him like someone who had been turning something over for hours and had finally decided to say it out loud. "The woman with the book," she said. "That was me." He turned back, looked at her. "I wanted to say thank you." She paused, "And I wanted to tell you something. Because I don't think those boys were just some young idiots making trouble." Her name was Phyllis. She'd lived in Gibson's for 22 years. She knew the Benfield name the way everyone on the Sunshine Coast knew it, attached to decisions made in rooms she'd never been invited into. She told him about the waterfront development, about the fishing cooperative that had been quietly losing its lease over the past 18 months. About the 3 families who'd received notices they didn't understand, drafted in language that didn't match any bylaw she'd been able to find. Nobody talks about it, she said, because the people who talk about it lose their business licenses. Callum sat down on the far end of the bench. Kodiak settled between them, his head on Phyllis's knee, before she'd had a chance to invite him. She laughed softly, scratched his ears. "He knows, doesn't he?" "He does," Callum said. She kept talking. Not because she'd decided to trust him, she barely knew him, but because some people have been carrying something alone for long enough that the weight finally outweighs the caution. What she described wasn't complicated. It was the ordinary machinery of small-scale corruption, a regional officer using discretionary permit authority to squeeze small operators, redirecting waterfront contracts to a holding company that didn't appear on any public register, and just enough informal muscle, Darcy being the most recent example, to remind anyone thinking of complaining where the lines were. "Someone started asking questions 8 months ago," Phyllis said. "A counselor named Vera Okafor. She's good, smart. She pulled 3 years of contracting records." She paused. She was told her daughter's daycare license renewal was under review. Callum looked out at the water. "Did she stop?" he asked. Phyllis shook her head. She stopped going to public meetings, but she didn't stop. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all. It looks like a woman still at her desk at 11 at night, working quietly, making no noise, drawing no attention. It looks like someone who has already weighed the cost and decided to keep going anyway. Callum spent the next 3 days watching. He was good at watching. It was, in many ways, the central skill of his profession. Not action, but patience, the capacity to observe without disturbing the surface. He moved through Gibsons and Setchelt the way he'd moved through environments with far higher stakes, drawing no second glances. A man and his dog walking, nothing more. Kodiak helped. A dog of that size and bearing could have made people uneasy. Instead, he made them open up. He was the reason the woman at the hardware store told Callum about the fishing co-op's locked storage shed. He was the reason the teenager working at the gas station mentioned the black pickup that parked across from Vera Okafor house 3 nights a week. That detail Callum filed very carefully. On the 4th day, he found the holding company. It took 3 hours with a public registry database and a satellite internet connection. Coastal Horizon Developments Limited, registered 18 months ago, listed operating address a postal box in West Vancouver. 2 directors listed, one of whom shared a surname with Ray Benfield. On the 5th day, he drove to the small office building where Vera Okafor worked part-time as a community liaison. He did not go inside. He sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes. He watched a black pickup slow down in front of the building, idle for 30 seconds, and leave. He wrote down the plate. On the 6th day, he called a number he hadn't dialed in 8 months. A colleague, a woman named Sergeant Donna Arcand, posted with the RCMP's Federal Serious and Organized Crime Unit in Vancouver, who had, at various points in her career, worked alongside people in Callum's line of work in contexts that were never written down anywhere. "I'm on leave," he said. "I can hear that," she said. He told her what he'd found. He read her the plate number. He gave her the company name, the filing dates, the counselor's name, and the name of the daycare. He said it plainly, without editorializing, the way he'd been trained to report. Facts, sequence, inference, clearly labeled as inference. There was a long pause. "This is a civilian matter," she said. "I know." Another pause. "How sure are you about the contracting timeline?" "Public records," he said. "Available to anyone who looks, and the intimidation of the counselor?" "Inference. Supported by pattern." He heard her exhale. "Give me 48 hours." He gave her 48 hours. On the evening of the 8th day, he was sitting on the porch of the cabin with a mug of tea, watching the light go off the water, when his phone buzzed. A message from Donna. No text, just a link to a press release from the BC Ministry of Municipal Affairs. An inquiry had been launched into contracting practices within the Sunshine Coast Regional District. A named official, Ray Benfield, had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. Below that, another link. Local news. A short piece written quickly, citing an unnamed source who had provided contracting documentation to a federal organized crime unit. Callum set his phone face down on the railing. Kodiak put his head on Callum's boot. The Ferry incident, as it turned out, had been filed properly by the younger RCMP officer despite the pressure. Or perhaps because of it. Darcy and his companions faced charges of mischief and intimidation. The older officer who'd let his pen pause for a breath was quietly transferred to a posting in Prince George before any of it became public. Vera Okafor gave a statement to the press the following week. She stood outside the municipal building in the rain, holding an umbrella, and spoke without notes. She said she'd started asking questions because that was her job. She said she was grateful to the people who had helped her keep asking them. She didn't name anyone. Phyllis heard about it on the local radio while driving home from the market. She pulled over. She sat in her car for a few minutes. Then she drove the rest of the way home. Nobody knew who had made the call to Vancouver. The press release thanked information received from a concerned member of the public, which was technically accurate and said nothing. On the 11th day of his leave, Callum and Kodiak walked the full length of the Suncoaster Trail. 18 kilometers through second-growth forest and rocky outcropping, ending at a lookout where on a clear day you could see all the way to the mouth of Howe Sound. The sky was low and gray, and the visibility was maybe 4 kilometers. It was enough. Kodiak ran ahead on the open sections and waited for him on the climbs. On the last evening, sitting at the edge of the dock behind the cabin, Callum thought about what Phyllis had said that first night on the bench. He'd thought about it several times since, not because it unsettled him, but because it stayed. He knows, doesn't he? He did. That was the thing about working alongside Kodiak for long enough. The dog didn't need things explained to him. He didn't need context or briefing or objective. He felt the temperature of a situation the way a sailor feels the wind. Not through analysis, but through something older and more reliable. He knew when to wait. He knew when to move. He knew, sitting between a stranger and a Navy SEAL on a waterfront bench in October, that the stranger needed to say something she'd been afraid to say. So he put his head on her knee. Callum thought sometimes that humans had trained the wrong species. He drove back to the ferry terminal on the morning of the 14th day. Same gray water, same mountains going in and out of cloud. A different vessel, same route in reverse. He bought a coffee from the small galley and found a seat near the stern, and Kodiak settled at his feet with the ease of an animal who has long since accepted that the journey is simply the journey. A young father and his daughter sat down nearby. The girl was maybe 4. She stared at Kodiak with the pure, unguarded wonder of someone who has not yet learned that some things should be feared. "Can I pet him?" she asked. She was asking Callum. He looked at her. "Ask him," he said. She looked at Kodiak. Kodiak looked at her. His tail moved once slowly against the floor. She reached out and placed her small hand on the top of his head, very gently, and Kodiak closed his eyes. The father caught Callum's eye over his daughter's head and nodded. The way parents nod when something unexpectedly right has happened, and there are no words adequate to it. Callum nodded back. The ferry moved through the water. The mountains held their positions. The crossing took 40 minutes, which was exactly as long as it took. There are men who spend their lives making noise, and men who spend their lives making things quiet again. Most people never see the second kind. Most people will never know their names, or what they carry with them, or the particular quality of stillness that settles over them when they've decided something must be done. What they know, if they're lucky, is the feeling of the ferry docking. The ramp going down, the ordinary world opening up again, slightly cleaner than it was before, for reasons they can't entirely name. That's enough. For the people who do this work, that has always been enough. Kodiak stood, stretched, looked up at Callum. Callum picked up his bag. 14 days. 2 weeks of nothing, mostly. One phone call that mattered. They walked off the boat together, into the gray morning light of Horseshoe Bay, and no one who saw them had any idea who they were.